and welcome to Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear, the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society. I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe, and thank you very much for joining the conversation today. Finding regeneratively grown agricultural products is getting easier, but as Earth911 contributor Sandy Schwartz recently wrote, summarizing the 6 regenerative product labels currently available to consumers, quote, unfortunately, no universal standard or certification system for regeneratively grown products is available. The practice of regenerative agriculture first took root in the 1960s and 70s after the term was coined by publisher Robert Rodale. But in recent years, an explosion of interest in regenerative practices following the release of the film Kiss the Soil, and in the midst of the frightening evidence that climate change is accelerating, has really brought regenerative agriculture into the forefront of conversations about how to eat healthily and in a way that supports the planet. Regenerative agriculture has been shown to restore topsoil lost to erosion and could help capture and store atmospheric carbon to help draw down the CO2 that is warming our planet. But of course, standards take time to develop, and we wanted to invite back the Savory Institute for an update about the oldest regenerative labeling program, the Land to Market label. And today we're joined by Wyatt Ball, Business Development Manager for Land to Market. The program is focused on connecting brands, producers, and participants in the food supply chain through their shared concern for land health. Founded in 2018, the Land to Market program helps companies source verified raw materials originating from regenerative farms around the world using empirical monitoring data from its Ecological Outcome Verification, or EOV, monitoring program. The Land to Market team currently tracks 3.5 million acres through the program and has certified more than 1,000 products. In addition to consumers, Land to Market also educates farmers about emerging regenerative practices with continuing guidance about how to improve land health. But because no two farms are alike, Land to Market avoids being dogmatic about which regenerative strategies should be used on a particular farm, emphasizing instead a holistic land management philosophy based on scientific insights into soil health. There's a lot to dig into on this topic of regenerative agriculture, so let's get into it. You can learn more about the Land to Market label at landtomarket.com. Land to Market is all one word, no space, no dash, landtomarket.com. Welcome to the show, Wyatt. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. It's a beautiful day here in Colorado. We've had a lot of precipitation kind of this spring, which is a welcome change from the previous year spring. So looking green, sunny day. Yeah, it's great. Everything's good. How are you doing?
Life is good. Life is very good. And it's also another beautiful day here in the Pacific Northwest. So we're all enjoying a little more water or precipitation this year. So it's good to be past the worst of the drought, at least for 2023.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to start off, you talking about your background. You got your start in the Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farms movement, which I did not know a lot about. Can you tell us about it, and how do people get involved in this? Because it seems like an important path to learning more about our relationship with the world.
Sure. It's been probably a little over 10 years since that kind of entryway into it all. And honestly, I stumbled upon it completely by chance. I did my undergraduate degree. My father's English, have a British passport, et cetera. So I actually did it over in the UK. And at the time, just a person I was, seeing, we broke up, and I had this plane ticket to Greece and I had to go somewhere, and I couldn't go to Greece obviously anymore. And the flight equivalent was in Portugal. Mm-hmm. And I'd always kind of grown up around farms, been interested, et cetera. And I was just looking for ways to go get involved, maybe spend some time on a farm, just, see what it was like essentially, and came upon this organization. People call it WOOFing, kind of as the acronym, if you like. And yeah, I just found out you could more or less go volunteer on, it's not even volunteering, I would say you go work in exchange for food and board. And essentially, yeah, what turned into an idea of, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ended up being probably 6 to 8 weeks, and at least in the first stint. And then I continued to do this all over the world throughout the course of my undergraduate. Whenever I had time, it was kind of how I would go travel and spend time in places maybe that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And I remember I was doing a business degree at the University of Bath. And when I was in Portugal on this first farm, and I wouldn't have known the words at the time, but it was in this regenerative vein or this permaculture vein, et cetera. It was very much no chemical, low disturbance, kind of these ideal principles of both vegetable and animal integration. And I remember thinking, how does this become something that someone at a business school who never grew up, in a multi-generational agricultural family? I'm from Charleston, South Carolina, so I'm actually an ocean boy at heart. Why does nobody talk about this? And that was kind of the first foray into it all. And this organization, they have individual country pages all over the world. Essentially, you join at a very nominal low fee. It's more or less just to support the running of the organization. And you can get access to a list of a bunch of different farms of a variety of types. It could be a creamery, a dairy, a small family farm, a larger farm. There's literally multitude of opportunities.
Well, so you clearly have dived deeply into regenerative practices. What do you consider the essential elements of regenerative agriculture? I stand on shoulders of giants in this movement. So I wouldn't say that I'm necessarily deciding what or isn't the principles of kind of regenerative ag, but there's kind of you'll hear a lot of folks talk about the 5 principles of soil or of regenerative agriculture or soil health, sometimes 6, which is kind of the, keep living roots in the ground at all time, minimal disturbance, no tillage or minimal tillage if possible, animal integration, live cover essentially. So, you have live roots in the soil, but also kind of no bare ground, a full level of cover, et cetera. And then just biodiversity at all costs. Nature never moves towards a monoculture if it can help it. It's always looking to increase biodiversity and, not trying to go on a tangent, but really, I don't know if you've seen that graphic kind of floating around. I only am on LinkedIn social media wise, but social media where there's like COVID and then the recession and then climate change and the final wave is biodiversity. And at the end of the day, biodiversity really is kind of the golden standard for me personally and what I really relate to and care about, because like I said, nature is always moving to a more resilient and diverse system. And when we look at regenerative agriculture, it's how do we mimic that trend of nature to have more diverse, more resilient, more cooperative synergies within an ecosystem as well as in a production agriculture system. Well, and recognizing that nature is always conducting new experiments, which kind of scares a lot of people, is really the essence of this is let nature be nature.
Yes. So, go ahead. Sorry. I was going to say, we just did it twice. What's something that I wanted to say about that is, and I'm forgetting the producer's name in my mind right now, which I'm sorry for that. But I heard once on a podcast, a guy who was talking about how he decided what his diverse cover crop seed mix would be kind of in his pasture, because this is, years ago and this wasn't a thing at all. Nobody was talking about it. And he talks about how he just walked to his local ditch, like essentially the edge of his property line where nothing but nature was essentially involved. Maybe there were deer ruminant grazing happening or the peripheries of his own cattle grazing, and saw that there was like 16, 18 different species, grasses, legumes, forests, etc. And and he was like, well, I just looked at that and decided, I guess I'll experiment with that. And that ended up being his diverse crop mix. And I think that can be, what you're talking about in terms of nature testing things and evolving. We as well have to test, evolve, be willing to let things go and kill your darlings when they don't work out, but also be able to push those boundaries in terms of moving towards that more diverse system.
Well, and as consumers of produce and various grown foods, most all foods being grown, except for those hyper-processed ones made from chemicals that we don't want. Imagine I'm at a farmer's market and somebody says, this is regeneratively grown. Yep. What questions would you ask to find out whether or not they were telling you the truth?
So this is always a funny question for me because personally, I live on a small ranch here in the Front Range. I'd say probably 85 to 90% of the food that I personally eat, consume, and interact with comes within a quarter mile of where I sleep. So I have a pretty fortunate experience with that. But I work for a company that's in global supply chains and verifying, certifying these kinds of claims for consumer education. And, I'd say the first thing before you even ask a producer anything is just try to educate yourself on these topics, right? Like try to understand what it exactly means to produce food in a way that maybe is mimicking or trying to mimic nature. Like what does this mean? So what is the difference between something like rotational grazing with animals or, true adaptive grazing and kind of trying to match the speed of nature, the speed of precipitation, the speed of growth to the animals? Now that's obviously, you could go down endless rabbit holes with that. And I'm not saying you can't ask questions without being self-educated, sure. But I think it's an important piece for folks to know, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to get in a, minute argument match with the producer saying, well, that's not regenerative and this is, and at the end of the day, every producer has some sort of context. I will get to the question, but
well, you're making an important point, but we don't need to argue with people, but we do need to understand what we share as language.
Exactly. And I think, my second piece would be, don't be afraid to ask questions. And most producers are very proud of what they do, even if it might, in that kind of removed consumer self-educated mentality, not be the optimum, right? But very few, if any, producers are out there, whether vegetable, whether, animal integration, whether polyculture, meaning running multiple animals, as well as maybe doing some market gardening. They're not proud of what they're doing. And just, everyone has an element of care. So just as long as that level of respect comes into play and understanding, then I think you can start asking those more specific questions, which are, maybe, hey, are you tilling up your pastures if it's animal integration? Or how often are you tilling your market garden? Are you spraying with glyphosate? Are you spraying pesticides? I see you don't have the organic certification, which a lot of producers can't necessarily afford at a scale like a farmer's market, nor necessarily need to. And just trying to ask those more specific questions. Hey, have you ever heard about the principles of soil health? And that could also, even just that question can indicate to what degree somebody is or isn't thinking about the importance of soil health. And in general questions, I find it's always more interesting to ask open-ended questions with producers than specific answers. So instead of, and I'm kind of even going back on myself a bit, but instead of saying, hey, do you till? Something like, what does soil health mean to you in your operation? And allowing a producer to be able to speak for themselves on a topic like that is pretty important. And you'll be surprised. My father lives in North Carolina, and there's a small farmers market there that I go to whenever I'm with him and get all of our produce from there. And I've asked this question a few times, kind of expecting, we're in a small corner of South Carolina, essentially, just across the border from North Carolina, thinking nobody. And it's amazing. People are talking about Joel Salatin. People are talking about Will Harris. People are talking about all these different pioneers. And you would never think necessarily, oh, this person's going to really care. But it's pretty amazing when you just ask those questions.
Now, obviously, land to market has a process, and you put a farm through a set of standards under the ecological outcome verification process, or EOV process. What does the farm have to do to become certified or qualified?
Yeah. And I would say that one of those farmer markets question definitely could be land to market verified. That's 100% an indication of, going through a monitoring and data assurance process. The EOV process is pretty unique. And this is kind of what, I'm not going to say we're the only ones doing this, or this is what sets us apart, but really I'd say we're the most outspoken and first in this space of being outcome based and not actually looking at practices. So we've talked a lot about practices up until this point, which are super important, right? It's like, it's important to have the textbook. It's important to study the information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're passing the test. And at the end of the day, land is in a constant state of flux. It's either regenerating or desertifying or degenerating. Doesn't mean that if it degenerates one year, it's all of a sudden degenerative agriculture. It's just land is in a constant state of flux, right? Due to management, due to climate, due to precipitation, lack of, et cetera, et cetera. And so what the EOV process is essentially a monitoring protocol developed by the Savory Institute in conjunction with a variety of different scientific bodies across the world. And it's a global program, a global protocol that's designed to help producers understand immediate feedback loops on the ground through measuring what we call leading indicators. And so leading indicators are these things that are more observational, such as your bare soil presence, how many different functional groups, meaning your warm seasons, your cool seasons, your trees, your forbs and legumes, et cetera. How much of this is present and what's the level of diversity, vigor, health, et cetera. What is the level of decomposition happening in the ecosystem? And all of these leading indicators, there's a few more, are kind of gauged into an ecoregion scorecard, if you like. So, somebody who gets constant precipitation year round, maybe like in the Northwest or the Southeast, versus somebody in the high plains or the Front Range who might only have a 2-month wet season, that scorecard is going to look very different.
Yeah.
And so that EOV protocol is designed for, again, a global context. So we're talking US here, but just as much as it works in the Northwest, it needs to work in Kenya, in the Australian, desert, essentially, in Argentina and Patagonia, in the Uruguay the grasslands of Uruguay. And the way that farmers actually engage with this is by communicating with what Savory has set up all across the world, kind of these affiliate independent businesses called Savory Hubs. And so the Savory Institute, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, for those who don't know, based here in the US, but is essentially a global education and training organization that deploys kind of this holistic management idea founded by Alan Savory, been doing it for 60 odd years, maybe even more. It's all about kind of adapting your management to your ecosystem, to your own context, to your financial constraints, et cetera. That's kind of the Savory IP. And they focus on supporting those hubs all over the world to develop and deploy those EOV resources in producers. And that's what's kind of unique, is that it's this decentralized model, because at the end of the day, if I'm sitting here in Colorado, even if I used to live in New Zealand, the person in New Zealand or the person in Uruguay or the person in South Africa definitely has a more apt regional context than a person sitting at a computer here in Colorado. And the same for even smaller distances, the Northwest, the Southeast, the Northeast of the Midwest, whatever it might be. And that's kind of the process. So a producer would engage with a hub would help kind of build a monitoring plan, explain the EOV, deploy those resources, and then the producer would then get a report back, kind of giving them a high level or detailed, depending on the year, essentially, insight into those EOV leading indicators. I'll pause there.
So it sounds, in a way, it reflects the same thing that we used to do and still do in the United States at the USDA. There's the Farm Service Extension Bureau that works with farmers. So you're setting up a distributed version of that can be global.
Yes, and it's the whole idea is that it's very much this outcome based. So it's really trying to understand how did management impact these specific indicators. And there's, of course, many monitoring programs all over the world. But what we find to be really unique about EOV is that, as a whole, it kind of goes in these 5-year cycles, right? So, and just as a clarification, I do not work on the EOV team. I've just been in and around EOV for quite a while now, that I feel comfortable talking about these things, but I'm by no means the EOV expert. I just want to say that. Okay. But the way that EOV works is kind of in these 5-year cycles. So in your first year, you have what we call a baseline year, which is a short-term monitoring event, kind of these leading indicators. And then also this overall long-term monitoring event, which what that essentially entails is a specific transect monitoring event where you're looking at much more specific indicators we call lagging indicators, which are maybe your carbon test, your water infiltration, your species count, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the kind of way to think about it in a maybe analogous way is the long-term monitoring is your full body checkup, right? You're checking everything, you're getting the blood tests, everything. And your short-term monitoring is kind of like your vitals. And so the idea, the whole reason it's designed is to continuously inform producers of a feedback loop for them to be able to adjust and understand the impacts of their previous year current management.
So the other question that I think a lot of consumers have when they see a label is who foots the bill? Is it the farmer seeking to be certified as they operate regenerative land, or is it the company buying the product seeking to be certified as using regenerative product?
Yep. So we've seen all of it. Every which way it can come down.
Okay.
The main thing is EOV is really a management tool. So land to market, just for even further clarification, land to market is, we are public benefit corporation here, headquartered out of Colorado as well. We're a majority owned by the Savory Institute. So we're very much tied, but we have our own team, kind of our own world, if you like, in terms of how we function. And EOV is very much this management tool, right? So the intention of EOV is to provide producers that management feedback. Land to market, our intention is to more or less communicate that regenerative state to the market. And so, however, and what that means is, if you have an individual product like a pack of ground beef at a farmer's market, and that producer feels the desire to say, hey, I want, my people at the farmer's markets to know I have land to market verified, they very well can do that. And that'll probably be coming from the producer, right? If that's their desired intent. We've also seen it where you have these large or even medium-sized brands, even small brands, say, I want to differentiate my product based on this regenerative state, based on this sourcing solution, essentially. That's where land to market kind of turns from a verification body into a sourcing and supply chain company, in the sense that we will essentially help a brand reverse deploy those resources down to the ground because they want to impact the supply chain and have the ability to claim in their final product, hey, this, leather product or this finalized meat product or this wool product, this natural fiber product, et cetera, is being sourced from, and they might be the ones who then deploy and pay for that EOV down the chain. But it really just depends on the unique system. And again, 6 continents, many different products all over the world. There's so many, it's kind of a hodgepodge of different ways that this can happen.
Now, one of the things that I've read about is you've continued to evolve. You're also looking at introducing something you describe as an ecological outcome unit, which is essentially an environmental credit, as I understand it. What does that represent in terms of carbon or other avoided environmental impacts? And are you going to be helping people monetize those avoided impacts?
So we tread lightly in this. The EOU is what it's been discussed for years, and it probably will be discussed for years forward. I wouldn't say that it's a primary business drive by any mean, where, and there's been a lot of controversy with the carbon credit market currently, and a lot kind of happening in the past few months that is highlighting the fragility of these markets and kind of the overstatement of the importance of one specific aspect. So in idea, the EOU is just like the EOV process measures kind of in general 4 ecosystem processes. So your mineral cycle, your water cycle, your energy flow, meaning your photosynthetic capacity, how much energy are you capturing in your ecosystem, and your community dynamics or biodiversity. That's kind of the holistic management tenet, et cetera. And so the EOU is by no means, it's in process, right? And it will be for a while. And we tread lightly in that because even in the conversations from a land and market perspective with brands, I mean, we push back on trying to turn something very natural into something mechanic. And we don't want brands to think that like the whole purpose of this is so that they can come out with some sort of scope 3 emissions reductions factor or, some sort of SBTI only claim, to where it's not really about the supply chain and supporting the producers, but it's more about, it's more about that emissions factor or trying to standardize a specific emissions factor for the whole planet, for example.
Well, but you could, of course, help the regenerative farmer monetize more. Is that the intent? And recognizing this is very much a developmental effort.
Yeah, I think it's too early to say, mainly because it's just kind of like a Pandora's box, right? It's like if, I'm going to speak from my own hat here. This is not to do with land and market or Savory, but just kind of my own perspective, even in the carbon markets, as somebody, as a young person who can't necessarily afford to own my own land or, pull out a large mortgage on farmland in a place that maybe I would want to live or even feels whatever. My fear is that once the carbon market and EOU, the idea is to be beyond that and maybe even be different than that. So I'm more just talking about the current carbon market, is that like, I don't want carbon to become like the mined resource of land, right? It's like, we don't want to myopically view just this one mineral. And so in the EOU mentality, it's very much in that development phase. And the idea is, of course, to support producers first and foremost. I mean, the whole ethos of the Savory Institute is farmer first. It's ingrained in every single person that works here. A majority of folks, if not directly have been a producer, have been working in and around agriculture for ages, or came into it from a perspective of, hey, I'm seeing a lot of wrong happening in agriculture and I want to do something about it. And so it's of course very much ingrained in the ethos of this idea. But again, it's about doing it right and strategically and with the right timing. And I think that just isn't necessarily today.
Evolution has its own cadence, and we will find it in a local context at a variety of different times. I want to open that Pandora's box you mentioned.
Yeah.
We'll take a quick commercial break first. We'll be right back. And now back to the discussion with Wyatt Ball, Business Development Manager for the Savory Institute's Land to Market Regenerative Agriculture Labeling Program. So, Wyatt, storytelling is a really important feature of Land to Market's work. How do you translate all the science, all the data that you've just been talking about with regard to regeneration into meaningful stories for consumers? What's your advice?
Yes, it is a difficult task, because kind of, piggybacking on this previous discussion about, not getting too specific or too focused on one aspect only. The storytelling piece is that we are trying to communicate regeneration, right? Mm-hmm. Of any kind. So a question I also love to ask anybody, consumers or individuals, is there an inherent difference in value in regeneration based on where you're starting from, and kind of like the ultimate regenerative place and a fully degenerated place? Mm-hmm. Like, is there an inherent difference in value if you regenerate from the very bottom of the barrel to, middle, or if you're already at the top to perfect, which perfect doesn't exist, of course? Is there a difference? And so when we're communicating as a company, and as we're trying to help the storytelling from a brand perspective, we really want people to understand that concept of, we are supporting this product is supporting not a specific product attribute, but land health is improving based on the integration of these animals. And so what this kind of fully culminates in as, like, let's say, a storytelling strategy, mm-hmm. is just getting that target off of an animal's back. There's too many conversations to when animals are just assumed, any ruminant or any animal, to be inherently wrong on this planet. And at the end of the day, ruminant species, whether it's deer, whether it's cattle, whether it's buffalo, whether it's goats, whatever ruminants, sheep, have been around for eternity. And these grassland ecosystems that we very much focus on, mm-hmm. co-evolved with ruminant integration, with animal integration, with this high level of stock density and intense grazing events, and then long periods or appropriate periods of rest. And so this communication strategy is really to help, consumers and brands alike tell the story and understand the story that an animal product is not inherently wrong, which has kind of been the drumbeat, I would say, for at least the entirety of my own life. Probably longer. I'm not 100% sure when it is certainly an all current discussion. Everybody does seem to want to debate whether or not we should or should not eat meat. But the point you're making is important. That is, those animals contribute to the cadence of nature. Yes.
And we just
are essential. I mean, not just contribute, but they're essential. So not to get overly technical, and maybe, for a lot of folks on this podcast already know this, but when a grazing animal actually wraps its tongue, I'm talking about a cattle here because they all eat differently, around a healthy blade or, grass, essentially a nice perennial grass, and rips up. What that does is it stresses the plant in a healthy way to where they more or less shed off a portion of their roots, which is more or less carbon and sugars to the biological activity under the soil, and then regrows again in terms of engaging in that overall biological and mineral cycle. Very basic explanation. Photosynthesis is a key aspect of all of that. And without that process, those roots won't reach deeper into the soil, and that grass won't create more basal cover to have a larger solar panel, i.e. the most efficient solar panel in the world, in terms of in terms of like, it just grows. I'm not going to get into the photosynthetic rates, but just in terms of being able to produce a massive amount of energy and harness that. And kind of a miracle, in my opinion, with ruminant animals. And we don't always think about energy conversion, but is, you have, I'm again use the example of a cow or cattle beast. Say a 60-pound calf drops, and within 2.5 years, that 60-pound animal can turn into a 1,200-pound animal, nutrient dense, incredible life on pasture, improving ecosystem. And all it's done is eaten free forage that requires it to eat it. And we're talking about, different things such as trying to make these really high tech, fancy labs where we grow things in. And it's like, these animals do it and they love doing it, and they help the ecosystem by doing it. Very different to a feedlot, of course. I'm not,
absolutely.
But when we think about this regenerative agriculture mindset, and kind of you mentioned this word contribute with animals, it's essential. And if those animals don't come and graze that grass, it becomes lignified, it becomes stale, it'll cover the ground, it will no longer allow for photosynthesis to occur, it will crowd out any potential new growth, and you'll see that degenerative desertifying process. I'm definitely oversimplifying it. We could just have an hour-long conversation on this topic, if not more, but I just want to give that kind of overview.
But it's important, and it really puts a clear focus on the context of the conversation. Do you think at this point that we are approaching a kind of a tipping point where consumer awareness about regeneration is becoming significant, or are we still working our way toward an awareness of the very complex set of relationships that we talk about when we talk about farming?
I think in the kind of evergreen or close to that consumer, it's definitely, it's not even a question. And I guess then the question becomes is how big is that consumer segment to the entire consumer segment of the world, right? And even consumers, I'm sure there's many people who have said it's kind of funny word, like just people, right? Like how many people understand the importance of regeneration? And I think every year the writing on the wall becomes bigger and clearer, and people are more easily interested. Like that barrier to adoption, if you like, that is what is decreasing on a yearly basis. So, price is always the biggest determining factor of pretty much any purchasing decision from any human being. But when it comes to, the word regenerative, I feel like we're kind of at this cusp of where sustainability, that word was maybe 15, 20 years ago before it kind of got a little controversial to say
what it is today,
where you could do anything and be sustainable. And I think that's where Land to Market, intelligently and aptly named itself Land to Market, because not saying that regenerative, that will happen. It's kind of maybe already is happening, but it's really about reconnecting that idea that animal product on the land, bringing it to market, and just making that connection piece. And I think that is also what's really fascinating, because something like leather, like if you're buying a leather boot, and there is this kind of communication and storytelling piece you were talking about, you're reconnecting that branch between a consumer's mindset and an actual product derived from an animal raised in a way which was positively impacting landscape. And I think that message is more digestible rather than kind of what has been, again, the drumbeat of the sustainability movement of like mitigate, do as least wrong as possible, but you're still going to do a little bit of wrong, but like at least it's not as bad as this other choice. And that's kind of, I think, just a more digestible message. And we're seeing more and more uptake from that, both on the brand and the consumer side.
Well, there some of the brands that have qualified for the land market label will surprise, and I think are also illustrative of that kind of growing awareness that everybody has. Uggs, the boot maker,
Yep.
Berland, the outdoor clothing company, and New Balance, the running shoe company, are all land to market certified. What are they doing that makes them certified?
Yeah. So the what that, so that's from the brand angle, right? So back to that EUV deployment, for example, Decker's UGG, they had pledged a 1 million acre pledge back in 2021, where essentially they were going to support the development, the deployment of EOV and holistic management training across producers in Australia, or in Oceania, Australia and New Zealand. And so the supply piece, what they're doing is essentially they're sourcing regenerative skins from sheep operations that are proving this positive land trend year on year. And so that's it's not that they're necessarily, going and producing anything on the land, but what they're doing is they're intentfully sourcing and creating those supply chains to be able to bring verified raw material into their product, to where they then can differentiate in their own products. This boot has been made from, a raw material, which again is positively impacting land bases. And so that's kind of how we see brands from that angle, or not kind of, how they do interact with our program, in the sense, it kind of turns into that sourcing solution company. So UGG being a land and market member, which is what they are indicating to the world, and through that product with that claim on it, that, hey, this product is indeed been gone through, or has gone through the chain of custody process, the whole process of making sure that from farm gate forward, these hides are supporting regeneration in the ecosystems which they derive from.
Well, and to your earlier point, that the land on which those skins were raised is now in a more regenerative state than it was before.
Exactly. And you'll hear us talk. The way we communicate is we never say a product is regenerative, because we're not measuring product LCAs or anything in this regard. But again, it's really about connecting that product to the land. Like that's the land to market. It seems like a silly name sometimes at first, but then when you realize, it's like, oh, the whole point is really to build that connection again in between the product and the land. Because I mentioned kind of this phrase of get the target off the animal's back. Really, what we're also trying to be at the same time as well is a voice for the land. And so when you see that seal, or when you see that communication, the indication to the consumer is that this product or this company understands and is supporting this idea of being a voice for the land, and no longer just, or not saying no longer, but, not trying to simply sell a message that might feel okay. And that's that.
So consumers are seeing a number of new labels out there, and there are several that address regeneration in various ways. Do you see evidence that we're going to consolidate around a standard set of certifications and metrics for regeneration?
I don't know the exact answer to that question, and I'm quite okay with that, in the sense, I think each one, the kind of major ones that exist today, are all trying to solve for, I don't want to say different issues in the whole, but kind of have, or their different focuses is maybe what I should say. So
maybe complementary would be another way.
Yes, exactly. I mentioned we're very much outcome based, really focusing on grasslands with animal integration. Well, grasslands, albeit are about 45% of all the world, aren't all the world. There's obviously a bunch of different ecosystems that exist. And, yes, it would be our dream that kind of these, for example, the Great Prairie that has been turned into, row crop feed for animals would just be healthy grasslands for animals. But that's a long discussion in a separate way. And so I could see that these programs continue to be complementary. I don't know about the answer just to consolidation, because I don't know if consolidation always leads to the best result.
Yeah.
And more so, I think it's important for folks and producers specifically to have as the choices that they can. I speak with a lot of producers, and I hope for any producers who I've spoke with who might be listening to this, you feel the same way as I do. But I really try not to force anybody to feel like they need to join our program, or we're the only program that exists, or, if you like, no, I mean, I've spoken to producers who do sell at the farmer's market, and I'm like, hey, I hear you. I don't know, like, EOV management tool, 100% do it, but I don't know if you necessarily need land to market. Like the place I live on here in Colorado, I mean, all the people that come here to buy their food, they know the farmers. Like, they don't need another label or verification scheme to prove to the consumers here on this place that we're doing the right things here. So it's very much about, for me, providing the producer the optimal choice and not making them feel pigeonholed into, if you don't have this verification, you're not regenerative.
Well, but going back to the conversation at the farmer's market that we started off talking about,
yep,
those open-ended questions are really good in a conversational environment. But maybe when I'm purchasing something as a consumer, looking for a condensed set of information, what should we be putting on labels?
Yeah,
or
so that's
extending labels in order to offer this information.
Exactly. And this is a great, and I hate ever making binary delineations. So again, not trying to do that, but for simplicity's sake, like, we have a brand member here as part of who's a meat company called Thousand Hills Lifetime Graze. And they have the Land and Market verified seal on their meat products, right? So ground beef, beef sticks, etc. And when you see that label in store, I mean, that is a verified product that has gone through that chain of custody, that is being sourced, aggregated from land bases that are indeed improving landscapes and regenerating land health. So that's it. That's your consolidated answer. You see that Land and Market verified, you can guarantee that I'm buying and purchasing a hamburger that I'm going to eat, that I can comfortably know and say, this beef was originally an animal that was grazing land in a way that was improving its health. And I don't know how much more information from a seal perspective is needed for that specific target. Now,
but our listeners have these kinds of questions. So not only was it sourced from a regenerative location, but was that location more than N miles from my home? Because that means there's shipping impact too. I mean, to your point, how brief can we be without obscuring some of the other consequences of our choice?
Yeah. And this is where I kind of think that the consolidation piece it both can be and cannot be the answer. Consolidation from a producer angle, you eliminate choice. From a consumer angle, you make it easier to understand. And so the question becomes back is how do we balance those interests, right? And Land and Market, I have no problem saying we do not, like I said earlier, we do not engage in the LCA world. Again, it's kind of funny, even as an individual, I work in a lot of these global supply chains, but I myself am quite a local supply chain engager. But, I think the more when you do see those other regenerative claims as well, or claims regarding food miles, for example, which isn't really necessarily to do with regeneration at all, it just is a supply chain shortness angle. It becomes down to what is the consumer's values, and how much do they want to know. And so I care about food miles myself, it matters a lot to me. I care about land impact. I care about animal welfare. I care about the use of chemicals. But to assume or to desire for one organization in the infancy of this movement, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, regeneration has been around for thousands of years. Indigenous people all over the world have engaged in this way of raising animals, interacting with the landscapes, planting vegetables. I mean, this is not new information. It's just it newly digestible in a different way, perhaps is maybe a silly way to say it, but that's how it's coming up in my head. And so I would say, it really comes down to, what does the consumer care about? And we at Land and Market are happy to be the ones to hold that really high integrity to the land health piece and allow for other folks to do what we don't think we would necessarily. I mean, we could do it, but it's not our expertise, and it's not where we feel we need to fill that market gap today. Now, could it be something in the future? Who knows? Who knows, really?
Well, then what I hear you saying is that if somebody is passionate about regeneration, that the best thing that they can do is to understand the relationship to where their food is grown and how it is grown. Is that the best place to start for a consumer who wants to take some steps in the direction of supporting regenerative efforts?
Definitely. And I think it all comes from an education piece. And, I'm sorry that I keep skirting the best kind, like what is the best thing to do answer, because it just kind of goes inherently against even the ethos of our company.
Sure.
In terms of what is your context, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, what do you care about? For example, I'll just give you an insight into like the production side, right? Mm-hmm. Within holistic management, you have this piece, which is your holistic context. So, I might really, like, biggest dream and passion in life is to be a single rancher on horseback where I spend 7 days a week out in the pasture moving animals. So I'll design my business and my grazing plan and my financial planning around me being available to work 7 days a week, 365 days, moving my animals twice a day. And through that, I might see the best impact possible on land regeneration. But I also might be somebody who loves my wife or, my partner and has multiple children or whatever, and want to go to the ball game on Sunday or whatever it might be. And I don't want to be moving animals on a Sunday. I want to be with my family, and so that grazing plan, that context will look different. And I think that for consumers, it's a similar thing again. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, what really matters to you? And is it that locality? Is it that land health? Is it all of it? Should you be looking for land to market products that are close to where you're from or where you're living in that moment? What is it that really matters to you? And that starting there and understanding your context then allows you to further envelop and further develop your true values when it comes to purchasing. And I think, again, kind of going back to something I said a little bit in passing, for the most part, if we're talking about the general consumer, out of the 8 billion people that live on this planet, price is the defining factor. Once you get past that, and if you get past that, then usually from like a marketing standpoint, all these different values come into play. And that's where I think the consumer has almost too many choices, both good and bad, for understanding what is that value alignment.
Well, that you really hit the nail on the head there. It is a personal choice. We have so many choices. Part of the function of marketing is to obscure the meaning of those choices, but good marketing can help us really understand our choices. And Land to Market is making a lot of efforts that are helpful. Where can people buy Land to Market products? How do you find a Land to Market certified product?
Yep. So on our website, you can see all the brands that we work with. You can find them in retailers. For example, I was in Natural Grocers the other day, and I saw multiple products that have that label. You got your Epic bars, you got your Alexander Family Milk, you got Kelowna Milk, which is a dairy organization here in the U.S. You can find ground lamb that's Land to Market verified in Whole Foods, in some stores around more on the West Coast, et cetera. So there's if you look for the seal, you will see it. And it's usually focused mainly on animal products. So, for example, Serenity Kids
Dairy,
baby food,
leather.
The Serenity Kids baby food is another one where they're for all over. I mean, I think they're in Targets too, et cetera, like all kinds of retailers, to where you'll see that seal on pack. And that's an indication. If you want to see kind of an overview of all the different brands that we work with and products that they have, then our website is a good place to see that as well. landtomarket.com.
Thank you so much for spending time with us today. I learned a lot, and I appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking with Wyatt Ball, Business Development Manager for the Savory Institute's Land to Market Regenerative Agricultural Certification Program. You can learn more about Land to Market at landtomarket.com. That's all one word, no space, no dash, landtomarket.com. Choices. The transition to a sustainable society is all about the decisions that we make as shoppers and as growers and producers of goods and services. The Land to Market label and others, including Certified Regenerative by A Greener World, Regen 1, Regenified, and many others, provide insights into the complex web of relationships that define and constantly redefine the ecosystem in which we live. From an evolutionary perspective, our access to additional information and insights is the fodder for better decisions that can reshape our world if we choose to pay attention to that data. Regeneration is a broad-based movement that reaches beyond farming, but it started in the agricultural sector because our relationship to the land is the most fundamental of our interactions. Yet, as industrial consumers, we've been mostly insulated from the decisions that determine whether we care for or casually destroy natural systems. Our first steps as food shoppers need to be based on a deeper understanding of where our food comes from, how it is grown, processed, and packaged. So head down to your local farmer's market and start to ask questions about their growing practices. Or look over the counter at the meat section of your grocery store and ask the butcher for details about the meat that you're considering. Where was it grown? How was it grown? How were the animals treated? Knowledge is more than power. It's the fuel for changing our world. And there's going to be no shortage of new data and labels on our food to make decisions about. So stay tuned for more coverage from Earth911. I hope you take a minute to share this podcast or any of the others that we've produced on sustainability in your ear by writing a review on your favorite podcast platform. It will help your neighbors find us because, folks, you are the amplifiers that can spread more ideas so that we create less waste. Please tell your friends, family, and coworkers they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the other fine purveyors of podcast goodness that they prefer. Thank you very much for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back soon with another innovator interview. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.